The day I accidentally spilled hot coffee on the most dangerous man in Portland, I was thinking about whether I had enough quarters for the laundry machine. That's the truth. Not poetic, not dramatic. I was calculating whether 2 loads could squeeze into 4 75s and quarters, and I turned too fast from the counter, and the full carafe in my hand connected with the chest of a man in a suit that probably cost more than my rent. I froze. He didn't. He looked down at his shirt, white, now very much not white, and then he looked at me, dark eyes, completely still. The kind of still that isn't calm, it's controlled. There's a difference, and I knew it even then, even before I knew who he was. "I am so sorry," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I didn't see you. I'll pay for the dry cleaning, I swear." "You won't," he said. "Just that, you won't." Not angry, not amused. Just a statement of fact, the way you'd say the sky is gray. He took the napkin I was holding out and pressed it once against his chest, then set it on the counter. He looked at me for a second longer than was comfortable. Then he sat down at the bar stool right in front of me, folded his hands on the counter and said, "Black coffee, please." So I poured him coffee. I still don't know why that detail sticks with me. The man I'd just drenched in dark roast sat down and ordered more coffee from me, and I just made it. My hands weren't even shaking. Afterwards, I thought maybe I should have been scared. But in the moment, something about his directness made me feel like the right response was to just be direct back. "My name is Jenna, by the way. Jenna Park. I'm 26. I've been a barista at Harlow's Coffee on NW 23rd for 3 years, and until that Tuesday morning in October, the most exciting thing that happened to me at work was the time a golden retriever knocked over our whole display of pour-over equipment. His name, I would learn later that day when my coworker Becca grabbed my arm in the back room and looked at me like I'd walked through a minefield in flip-flops, was Callum Mercer. Not that Callum Mercer. You probably haven't heard of him. He doesn't do interviews. He doesn't show up in lifestyle magazines. He doesn't get photographed outside restaurants. What he does is own things, buildings, companies, warehouses along the waterfront. Half the commercial real estate redevelopment happening in inner Portland for the past decade has his name somewhere at the bottom of the paperwork, if you know to look. "He bought this building," Becca whispered. "6 weeks ago. Nobody told us." I looked through the pass-through at the man sitting at my counter drinking his coffee, reading something on his phone, his ruined shirt dried to a dark stain by now. "Okay," I said. "Jenna, he bought the building. Like, the whole building. Harlow's is on a month-to-month lease." I understood what she was telling me. Harlow's had been on NW 23rd for 11 years. Maggie, who owned it, had started it in this space, when the neighborhood was still a little rough around the edges, when a hand-lettered sign and a good cup of coffee was enough to make a place feel like home. It had become home to regulars who came in every single morning, to the book club that took the corner table every Thursday. To me, honestly, in a way that felt embarrassing to admit out loud. If he decided to not renew the lease, Harlow's was done. I went back out front. He was still there. I refilled his coffee without asking, because that's what you do for someone sitting at the bar who's been there a while, and I said, without entirely planning to, "Can I ask you something?" He looked up from his phone, those same dark, patient eyes. "What are your plans for the building?" He studied me for a moment. "You're asking as an employee of the tenant. I'm asking as someone who'd like to know," I said. "You own it. You don't owe me an answer. But I figure if you're coming in here the same week, the lease paperwork is sitting somewhere unsigned, you probably knew what you were walking into. So, what are you planning to do?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something quieter than that. "I haven't decided," he said. "That's either honest or diplomatic." "It's both," he said. He left a 20 on the counter for a $6 coffee and walked out. Becca appeared at my elbow the second the door closed. "What did you say to him?" I asked about the lease. She stared at me. "You just asked him?" He didn't seem like someone who appreciates being talked around. She kept staring. Then she said, "You're either very brave or very stupid, and I genuinely cannot tell which." I thought about it. "Probably both," I said. He came back the next morning. Same stool. Black coffee. He had a different shirt on, deep charcoal, no tie today. He didn't mention the previous day's incident, and neither did I. He came back the morning after that. By the 4th morning, I didn't ask what he wanted. I just started his coffee when I saw him come through the door. He noticed. He didn't comment on it. But I caught him watching me for a moment before he looked back at his phone, and there was something in that look I couldn't quite name. Not quite curiosity. More like someone recalibrating something. We didn't have conversations exactly. We had exchanges. He'd say something brief, I'd respond, and then we'd both go back to what we were doing. But the exchanges started getting a little longer, a little less transactional. He mentioned, once, that the coffee at his office tasted like regret. I said that was a tragic condition, and he should see someone about it. He looked at me for a moment and said, very seriously, I'm working on it. I laughed. I wasn't expecting to, and I think that surprised him more than anything else had. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, because nothing in my life in any way prepared me for it, was that Callum Mercer wasn't just a real estate developer. The buildings were real, the companies were real. But underneath all of that, embedded in the infrastructure of what he'd built, was something that the Portland Business Journal would never print, and the city planners he met with would never acknowledge. Becca told me some of it. She'd done more digging after that first day. She showed me a Reddit thread that had been taken down, a post on a local news site that had been edited heavily. The words organized crime appeared more than once, and not in a historical context. I sat with that information for a while. I won't pretend I wasn't scared, because I was. A low, quiet kind of scared that settled in my chest and didn't leave. I started being more aware of the door when he came in, of whether anyone came in with him. Sometimes 2 men in dark jackets sat at a table near the window. They never ordered anything, and I learned not to approach them. I started noticing little things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way the room's noise level subtly shifted when he walked in, even though most of our regulars had no idea who he was. The way he sat with his back to the wall. But here's the thing I kept coming back to. He was unfailingly polite to me. Not in a performative, I'm the important one way. Just genuinely courteous. He said please and thank you. When the cafe was crowded and I was clearly slammed, he waited without any of that impatient energy that some customers radiate like a heat lamp. Once, a man at the counter was rude to me about his order. The kind of low-grade condescension that food service workers absorb daily, and I watched Callum Mercer look at the man with an expression so flat and unhurried that the man actually stopped mid-sentence and changed his tone. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him. The man said, "Sorry about that," to me, which I'd never gotten from him before, and Callum went back to his phone. "Did you just—" I started. "Your latte art is very good," he said, which was not an answer. I didn't push it, but I thought about it. A little over 3 weeks after he first walked in, Maggie called a staff meeting before opening. I knew what it was going to be about before she started talking. I could see it in the way she was holding her coffee cup with both hands, the way she wasn't quite looking at us. The lease wasn't being renewed. The building had a new development plan. We had 60 days. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone is absorbing bad news simultaneously. Becca reached under the table and grabbed my hand. Our other coworker, Pete, who'd been with Maggie since year 2, looked like someone had taken the air out of him. Maggie cried a little, which she apologized for, which made all of us cry, which she apologized for more. I went home that night and sat on my apartment floor and thought about all of it. About the regulars who'd be losing a place they'd been coming to for years. About Pete and Becca and everyone else whose jobs were disappearing. About Maggie, who'd given 11 years to this corner. I thought about Callum. I hadn't seen him that day. He hadn't come in, and I didn't know what I was feeling. It wasn't exactly anger, though anger was in there. It was something more like grief with an edge to it. Like something had been taken, and there was a face I could attach to the taking. The next morning he walked in at his usual time. I made his coffee, set it in front of him. Then I folded my arms on the counter and I said, 60 days. He looked up. Maggie told us last night, I said. 60 days, the lease is done. He held my gaze. I know. Did you know when you started coming in here? A pause. I knew about the lease. So you sat here every morning, drinking coffee made by people whose jobs you were eliminating. Yes. I hated that he didn't dress it up. I wanted him to defend himself so I could argue with the defense. Instead, he just confirmed it, and that made everything more complicated. Why? I said. Why keep coming in? He was quiet for a moment, then. I had reasons that made sense to me at the time. And now, he looked at his coffee. Now I'm less certain about them. I didn't know what to do with that. I turned away to deal with the morning rush, and when I looked back 20 minutes later, he was gone. No 20 on the counter this time. I felt something plummet in my chest that I refused to examine too closely. He came back the next day, and the day after that, he started staying longer, not hovering, not in the way that makes the space feel claimed, just present. He'd bring a laptop some mornings, or a folder of papers, and he'd work quietly at the bar, and occasionally we'd talk between rushes. He asked me once how I'd ended up in Portland. I told him about growing up in Sacramento, coming up here for college, falling in love with the city in that helpless way people do, and never quite managing to leave. "What did you study?" he asked. "Landscape architecture," I said. That surprised him. "You design spaces." I was supposed to. I interned at a firm for a year after graduation and learned that I deeply disliked designing spaces for people who had no interest in the people who would actually use them. I shrugged. "So now I make coffee, and I'm much happier." "You make very good coffee," he said. "I also design the window boxes," I said. "The ones outside, Maggie lets me. Every season I do something different." I stopped. Did, I guess. He looked out the window at the boxes. It was October, and I'd planted them with ornamental kale and deep orange pansies and a few late-season herbs. He looked at them for a long moment. "You have good instincts," he said, "for how things fit together." I didn't know if he meant the plants or something else. With Callum, I'd started to learn. The surface of a sentence sometimes had a different bottom than you expected. Things shifted after that conversation, in a way that was hard to pinpoint. He started arriving a little earlier, staying a little later. Once, on a slow Thursday afternoon, he sat at the bar for 2 hours while I cleaned and reorganized the shelving behind the counter, and we talked the whole time about the city, about a building he'd renovated in the Pearl District that he was quietly proud of, about a pocket park 3 blocks away that was being redesigned badly and why. He knew a lot about urban space, I realized, more than I'd expected. He thought about it in a way that wasn't just financial. "You could have gone a different direction with all this," I said once. "The buildings. You could have built things people actually wanted." "I thought I was," he said, and something in his voice was so honest, so unguarded, that I almost said something I wasn't ready to say. Instead, I refilled his coffee. 3 weeks before our last day, something happened that changed everything. I was closing up alone. Pete had left early for a family thing, Becca had a class, and I'd just turned off the main lights when the door opened. Not Callum. 2 men I didn't know, and they had the same quality as the men in dark jackets who sometimes sat by the window. But these weren't the same men, and they weren't there for coffee. I don't fully remember the next 5 minutes. I remember being very calm in a way that felt like my body protecting my brain from the reality of the situation. I remember one of them asking me something about Callum, and I remember saying I was just a barista. I didn't know anything, which was mostly true. I remember the sound of the door opening again, and then both men's attention snapping to the entrance. Callum walked in. What happened after that was brief and controlled and very quiet, and I won't describe it in detail, because honestly I've turned away from the parts I didn't want to see. What I know is that within a few minutes the men were gone, and Callum was standing in my cafe with a cut along his jaw and slightly damaged knuckles, and the same controlled stillness he always had, except it was wound tighter than usual. He looked at me. "Are you hurt?" "No," I said. He exhaled. "Just slightly." "Good. Are you?" He looked at his hand. "No, that's clearly not true," I said. My voice sounded remarkably normal. "Sit down. I'm getting the first aid kit." He sat down. I found the kit under the counter, and I cleaned the cut on his jaw, and my hands were steady the entire time, in a way that I would later marvel at. We were very close together, and he went completely still while I worked, and when I was done I realized I'd been holding my breath. "You should have waited for someone to walk you out," he said quietly. "I've been closing alone for 2 years," I said. "I know." A pause. "That's going to change. I should have argued with that." Instead I said, "Who were they?" He held my gaze. And then he did something I didn't expect. He told me. Not everything, not the full architecture of what his life had been built on. But enough. Enough that I understood what he was, what the money came from, what the 2 men in the door had wanted and why. He told me with the same directness he'd used on the first day about the lease. No softening, no strategic omission. "You're telling me this because you think I deserve to know," I said when he finished. Yes. And because you're about to make a choice that affects you, and you want me to understand what it means. He went very still. What makes you say that? Because you've been sitting at my counter for a month and a half watching me, I said. And I've been watching you back. And something in you has been calculating something. I don't know what exactly. But the way you're telling me this feels like clearing ground. He looked at me for a long time. I've decided to cooperate with the U.S. Attorney's Office, he said. Federal investigation. I've been negotiating terms for several weeks. I took that in. That's not a small decision. No, it puts you in danger. More than I'm in now. Temporarily, yes. And what happens to the buildings? The companies? Some will be sold, some transferred. The ones that are legitimate I'm keeping. He paused. I'd like to revisit the lease on this building. If Maggie is willing. I stared at him. You? What? The development plan can be modified. It's my plan. I made it. Something crossed his face that might have been a different version of him, an earlier one. I've been building things for 15 years, and most of them look impressive, and none of them feel like anything. He looked around the cafe. At the window boxes he could see from his stool. Dark outside now. This feels like something. I sat down on the stool next to his. My legs had finally decided they'd been cooperative long enough. Callum, I said. It was the first time I'd used his first name. He looked at me. You're turning your entire life inside out, I said. I'm aware. Is there anything I can do? He was quiet for a moment. Then, you already did it. I spilled coffee on you and asked impertinent questions about your real estate holdings. Yes, he said. And this time it was actually a smile. Not large, not performed, just real. That's exactly what you did. The next 2 months were not peaceful. I want to be honest about that. There were federal investigators in and out of his office. There were people in his world who did not react well to what he was doing. There were nights he'd text me at 11 p.m., saying he was outside, and could we just sit somewhere for a while? And I'd meet him at the cafe. I had a key, and we'd sit in the dark with 2 cups of coffee, and not always talk very much, and that was enough. His security detail, now legitimate and operating with full transparency, drove me home on the nights I asked them to. I stopped closing alone. He didn't make a production of that, just arranged it quietly, which is very Callum. Once, during one of those late nights, I asked him when he'd decided to cooperate, to change the lease, to come back every morning after the first day. He thought about it. The lease I decided when you asked me directly, and I couldn't find a reason that held up. And the other thing? The morning you told me about the landscape architecture degree, he said. And the window boxes. You gave up a version of your life you'd worked toward, because the actual work felt hollow. And you started over, and you weren't bitter about it. You were just done with the hollow version and living the real one. He looked at me in that careful, patient way he had. I'd been living the hollow version for a long time, he said, and I kept telling myself there would be a point where it became the real one. Did it? No, he said. You need to build the real one. It doesn't arrive. I reached across and put my hand over his, the one with the faded marks across the knuckles. He turned his hand over and held mine. We sat there until the coffee went cold. The U.S. Attorney's case took 14 months from the day Callum walked into their office. I won't pretend it was easy or clean or without cost. There were months where he was consumed by it, where the weight of what he was doing pressed down on him in ways that were hard to watch. There were people who called him a rat, and people who called him a coward, and people who simply disappeared from his life without saying anything at all. He lost business relationships he'd had for years. He lost, I think, a version of himself he'd been performing for a long time. What he gained was harder to describe and more real. Harlow's got a new 5-year lease at the same rate as the old one. Maggie cried. Pete cried. Becca did not cry, but she did hug me so hard I felt my spine recalibrate. I put new plants in the window boxes for spring, pale yellow daffodils, and a climbing something that Maggie let me train up a little trellis I added to the facade. The regulars noticed. They always notice. Callum comes in every morning. He still sits at the same stool. He still gets black coffee. He still tips too much, and I still accept it. And that's an argument we've decided to table indefinitely. He calls me Wildflower. I don't know exactly when that started. Sometime in those late-night coffee sessions, I think, when we were both running on too little sleep and too much honesty. I told him it was a ridiculous nickname, and he said he'd found it apt, given my habit of putting down roots in unexpected places and being extremely difficult to remove once established. I couldn't argue with that. I'm still figuring out what we are. That's the honest answer. Whatever it is, it grew slowly and in a direction neither of us planned. And it feels like something I built rather than something that happened to me. And those two things feel different in a way I didn't used to understand. Last Tuesday, I was late getting the counter set up before opening because I was replacing a dead bulb in the pendant light above the far window. And when Callum came in, I was still up on the step stool, reaching for the fixture. He stood below me with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked up. I could have done that, he said. I've been changing light bulbs since I was 8, I said. I know, he said, with that quiet patience that I will probably never entirely get used to. I just like to be useful. I climbed down. He was right there, closer than I expected, and I didn't step back. You are useful, I said. Good, he said. He picked up the dead bulb from the counter where I'd set it, walked to the trash can by the door, dropped it in, and then went and sat at his stool. I made his coffee. He said thank you. Outside, the window boxes caught the early light, and the neighborhood started to wake up the way it does every morning. Slowly, and then all at once, and it felt, the way it always does when I'm paying attention, like exactly the right place to be.